Okay, let's go ahead and get started. First, I want to see if you have any questions about the consonants that we talked about last time. You clear on the distinctions, degrees of constriction? Yeah, kind of, maybe. Degrees of constriction, the frequencies associated with them, and the amplitude associated with them. So those are the main things to keep in mind with the consonants. Today we're going to ease our way into the source filter theory and then get hardcore next week into the quarter wavelength resonating theory. That is the last challenging thing that you will have to face this semester in this class. So I want to kind of work our way into it gradually because it is truly ugly. And what I'd like to start with today, we're going to look at a couple of videos today. That doesn't mean break out the popcorn and, you know, start snoring, because what's covered in the videos will be covered on the quiz. I'm going to be taking notes during them. If you see me writing, you probably know it's important, but focus on the video. This will ease us into, kind of get us back into thinking about physical acoustics, which is important for the quarter wavelength resonating theory, and then an overview of articulation, just kind of as a refresher. So we'll go ahead and start with that. I think sound would be good.
Human speech, perhaps more than any other ability, sets us apart. We can rapidly produce a stream of phonemes and consonants in innumerable combinations, with enough distinctions to express the fine nuances of our perceptions,
Don't let the guy's voice
emotions,
put you to sleep.
indeed
There's
our
a little
entire human
progressive
experience.
relaxation
In this film, we're interested in acoustics of human speech, how our bodies interact with air to produce sound waves. The air inside the body that is relevant to acoustics is found in three areas: the supraglottal area, which includes all of the air spaces that extend from the vocal folds up to the lips and nostrils, an area called the vocal tract; the glottal area, which is the ever-changing space between the vocal folds; and the subglottal area, which extends from beneath the vocal folds down the trachea. The air outside the body, particularly at the lips and nostrils, also plays a significant role in shaping acoustics. We will see that our bodies are highly adapted to the elastic properties of air, exploiting it, stretching and compressing it in many ways to create human speech. Let's examine a few features of air that we exploit, and begin by looking at air in its smallest units, the air particles. The air particles move randomly about in what is called Brownian motion. If undisturbed, they keep themselves more or less evenly distributed in what is called the equilibrium. To make the concepts easier to see, let's reduce the number of air particles and remove the random motion. When we disturb the equilibrium, the air particles move about, trying to return to equilibrium. We can see how elastic the air is, stretching and recoiling, bunching up, and spreading apart. And we can see that each disturbance causes a wave to roll through the air particles. When the disturbance compresses the air particles, the wave is called a condensation wave. The particles condense at the wave front. When the disturbance stretches the air particles, the wave is called a rarefaction wave. The air particles become rarer in the area. If we mark the front of each wave, we can see that there is a certain distance between each wave. This distance is called the wavelength. In this example, the length between each wavefront is the same because the disturbances occur at the same frequency. Let's look again at the air particles while they are in random motion. Here we can see how the frequency of the disturbance is inversely proportional to the wavelength. If we increase the frequency, the wavelength decreases. If we decrease the frequency, the wavelength increases. Let's return to the single row of air particles. We have been disturbing the air particles with a smooth and steady back and forth motion, which produces a wave called a sine wave. Now let's disturb them with a complex motion, which produces what is called a complex wave, a wave that has within it smaller compressions and rarefactions. If we disturb them with a different complex motion, we create a different complex wave. To better understand this motion, let's isolate a single air particle. We can see that it is moving back and forth, speeding up, slowing down. The air particle hovers around its original position, trying to get back. It aims, overshoots, turns around, overshoots, always heading for its center spot, like a pendulum. Understanding sound can boil down to understanding this oscillating motion, because all of the air particles oscillate the same way. Each, however, begins its oscillation a little later than the one before it. This delay, however, is due to inertia, and it creates interesting changes in how the neighbors compress and rarefy, creating variations in pressure, an important concept in acoustics which we will look at in detail now. Let's examine this single area. Inside, the number of air particles in equilibrium represents the baseline pressure. The number of air particles within the space determines the pressure there. As a compression wave moves through, the air particles condense and rarefy, increasing and decreasing the overall number of air particles within the area. When the number of air particles increase above the baseline, the positive pressure increases in the area. When the number of air particles decrease below baseline, the negative pressure increases there. Looking from the side, we can more readily see the number of air particles increase and decrease inside this area. As a wave moves through, the pressure in the area continuously changes in a cycle, gradually from its positive pressure peak to its negative pressure peak. Now notice that the greater the distance we push the air particles, the more of them we can move into and out of the area, creating greater pressure changes, both positive and negative. With less distance, we can move only a few air particles in and out, creating mild pressure changes. The distance we push the air particles, whether great or small, is called the amplitude. If we look at several different places, we can see that the pressure peaks at different times. Each place has air particles condensing and rarefying in the same way, just a little later than the one before it. At any given time, the pressure differs from place to place, and at any given place, the pressure differs from time to time. So what is the pressure in the wave? The answer depends on where and when you are looking, which is either at what is called the place domain or the time domain of the wave. Now let's take a more detailed look at the waves as a whole. Notice first that each wave propagates through the air at the same speed, even though, as we have just seen, the air particles within the wave are moving at many different speeds. In other words, the speed of the disturbance is one thing, the speed of its propagation through the air is another. The actual travel speed of the waves depends on the conditions of the air, its temperature, for instance. It moves approximately 350 meters per second and slightly faster in the warmer air inside the body. This speed is called the speed of sound. Notice also that anything can disturb these air particles and start a wave. vibrating wood, as is the case of a violin, a vibrating string, as in a guitar, or even a vibrating wall of air, which is important for understanding speech acoustics. The next important aspect of waves is that they reflect when they hit a change in impedance. We intuitively understand the change in impedance when a sound wave hits a hard surface, such as a canyon wall, which then creates an echo. But a wave can reflect at a change as subtle as the air's impedance at a larger or smaller opening. The difference in impedance creates something like a wall of air at the larger or smaller opening. Of course, if the wave hits the new wall of air, it disturbs the air in that space too, sending off another wave. When the wave reflects, it interacts with the next oncoming wave. Let's look at the side view to better understand this interaction. To clarify, let's create another row of air particles. The top row to illustrate the original wave, which is called the incident wave, and the bottom row to illustrate the returning wave, which is called the reflected wave. When the reflected wave reaches the cylinder, it peaks together with the next oncoming wave. They peak together inside the area. In this example, the two waves are synchronized. They double the number of air particles that condense and rarefy at the same time and place. Let's look at this again. At any given time, the number of air particles increase and decrease. And in this example, the two waves condense and rarefy the air particles at the same time. These two waves are said to interfere with each other constructively. Now notice the number of air particles in the cylinder when the reflected wave arrives sooner. While one wave condenses the air particles, the other rarefies them. Both waves give and take continuously, making little change in the overall number of air particles, which means little change in pressure in that area. By arriving earlier, the two waves cancel each other. They are said to interfere with each other destructively. Now, let's change the arrival time a little more. In that area, the reflected wave now arrives partially in sync and partially out of sync with the next oncoming wave. The overall number of air particles increase and decrease less dramatically. How much pressure there is in the cylinder depends on when the reflected wave meets the next oncoming wave. Timing is critical. Two waves from separate disturbances can also travel together. When their peaks coincide, they double the pressure everywhere they go. One can also travel behind the other. Now they raise or lower the pressure by a less amount. We can see that the waves can spread just far enough to even cancel each other. Let's review these details. A disturbance compresses and stretches the elastic air, which begins a wave. The frequency of the disturbance is inversely proportional to the wavelength. The motion creates changes in pressure, which varies in time and place. The wave reflects when it hits a change in impedance. The reflected wave combines with the next incident wave, which further modifies the pressure. The combined pressures depend on the timing. The travel time of the wave is constant as long as the air's condition remain the same. As we shall see, the body is highly adapted to exploit each of these features in combination to create distinct human speech sounds. Now let's leave our drawings of the air particles and focus only on the wave fronts, understanding all the while the underlying motion of the air particles. To narrow our understanding of the acoustic events inside the vocal tract, we'll look at what is called the source filter theory, and focus on vowel sounds. To simplify matters even more, let's iron out the vocal tract and shape it into a smooth tube. Now let's look at one source of vocal sound, the vocal folds. As we recall, the vocal folds act like a valve, opening and closing, letting the high-pressure air from the lungs pump into the vocal tract. They go through a cycle, taking a specific amount of time to complete, and newly disturb the air at each cycle with complex motions. The vocal folds can open and close at many different frequencies, as frequently as 1,000 times a second for high C, or as low as 150 times a second for low C. With the vocal folds in place, we have a tube that is essentially closed at the vocal folds and open at the lips. To see inside, let's make part of our schematic vocal tract invisible. As the vocal folds open, the air from the lungs disturbs the air in the vocal tract and causes a complex wave to travel down the tube. This wave, because it is a complex wave, has many component frequencies, each with a certain amount of pressure. The exact pattern and pressures of these component frequencies depends on how the vocal folds vibrate. As shown in another film in this series, entitled The Source Filter Theory, the vocal folds can vibrate in many complex waves, sending many different patterns into the vocal tract. Let's keep an eye on the area next to the vocal folds. At each new cycle, the vocal folds stimulate new pressure oscillations, continuously changing from positive to negative pressures there. To simplify things still further, let's follow just one of these component frequencies. But keep in mind that what happens to this one component happens to all of them. First, as it leaves the vocal folds, it propagates down the tube, just as we've seen. When it arrives at the lips, it hits the sudden expanse of outside air and the change in impedance. The large expanse of outside air absorbs the pressure, rarefying the condensed air particles, which disrupts the wave pattern and creates a new disturbance, which now causes a new wave to head back toward the vocal folds, this time as a rarefaction wave. When the reflected wave arrives back at the vocal folds, it interacts with the pressure in the area next to the vocal folds, which, as we remember, is continuously changing. In this example, it arrives to interact with negative pressure, the rarefying air particles. Since negative pressure interacts with negative pressure, the negative pressure increases. This new change, this new disturbance due to the increased negative pressure, kicks off another wave back toward the opening, where once again it interacts with the wall of outside air. Now, with greater negative pressure, air particles rush in from outside to condense, which then increases the pressure, creating yet another disturbance, kicking off yet another wave, a condensation wave, to head back toward the vocal folds. The reflected wave arrives at the vocal folds as it is sending the next wave, arriving in this example at peak positive pressure.
Don't worry about the details of this.
The reflected wave and the next incident wave combine to increase the overall pressure and start the whole sequence over again. Only this time, this component now has greater amplitude. Running smoothly, we can see that the reflected wave gets a push from the vocal folds at just the right time to keep it going. Like pushing a child in a swing, the timing is coordinated. The two waves interfere with each other constructively. Notice that the length of the wave, combined with the constant speed of sound, determines when the reflected wave will arrive back at the vocal folds. The tube length governs the wave's round-trip frequency. This frequency is called the tube's resonance frequency, or to use another term, its formant. If we speed up the vocal fold cycles to 3 times as fast, all of the waves arrive back in sync with the vocal folds. Like a juggler, the vocal folds disturb the air at the same frequency as the round-trip frequency of the waves. Notice that the waves always meet in the same two places along the vocal tract. Here, the waves always cancel each other. Here, the waves always increase the pressure, undulating between positive pressure and negative pressure. Since this pressure change is regular and always in the same place, it appears to be standing still and is called a standing wave. This continuous, smooth change from negative to positive pressure occurs because the frequency of the source matches the frequency of the wave's round trips. But now notice what happens when we slow down the disturbance caused by the vocal folds to a frequency somewhere in between. Now the reflected wave, a rarefaction wave, meets a condensation wave coming through the vocal folds. While one is rarefying the air particles, the other is condensing them, canceling each other. This component frequency from the vocal folds falls in the cracks of the resonance frequency of the vocal tract. Let's look at these different vocal folds frequencies again. Of all the possible frequencies that can be stimulated by the vocal folds, you can see that the reflected wave and the next oncoming wave from the vocal folds can interact under many conditions, either perfectly in sync, partially in sync, or completely out of sync. In this way, the reflected waves, due to the length of the vocal tract and the constant speed of sound, filter the pressure in the source wave, the wave generated at the vocal folds. This concept is the core premise of the source filter theory of vocal sounds. Now let's introduce another level of complexity and open the vocal tract, somewhat resembling a dropped jaw. The sudden expanse in the middle introduces a change in impedance that disrupts the wave and causes a new wave to reflect back, this time causing it to arrive sooner, just in time for a coordinated condensation from the vocal folds. The new cross-sectional area, the new wall of air, shortens the distance the wave has to travel, raising the frequency of its round trips. In other words, the change in cross-sectional area raises the resonance frequency, the formant. The wave at the new cross-sectional area, however, introduces a disturbance that registers on both sides. When the wave arrives, it both reflects and transmits into the larger area, and the larger second area reduces the pressure in both waves. Notice that changing the cross-sectional area does two things. It causes a reflection and transforms the pressure when the wave arrives. If the second area became larger, it would reduce the pressure even more. If it became smaller, however, it would increase the pressure and would reflect a condensation wave rather than a rarefaction wave back toward the vocal folds. If we change the cross-sectional area of the vocal tract in several ways, each difference creates a new disturbance, which both reflects and transforms the pressures. Even within any one area, this one for instance, the wave reflects back and forth. The combined pressure depends on the pressure and timing of the arriving waves at the boundaries. When we change the size of the cross-sections, we change the timing of the reflections, the pressures, and consequently how these waves interfere with each other. Remember that we have been following only one component wave and a complex wave from the vocal folds. You can imagine that the reflections and pressure transformations increase dramatically in complexity with all components from the source wave. Though following all of those waves would be too complex to see, what happens to them is simple. The underlying air particles within each wave will always add together so that they interfere positively, interfere partially, or interfere negatively. After many cycles, each component wave makes it through the complex cross-sectional areas of the vocal tract. Having stepped up in pressure, stepped down in pressure, and interacted with many other reflected waves, the component wave finally arrives at the lips with some amount of pressure, with anywhere from much less than it started to much more, ultimately shaping the complex waves of the vocal sounds. In the real vocal tract, we can begin to wonder at the complexity of all the changes in the cross-sectional areas, each one creating yet another reflection and transformation of the pressures. We can extrapolate from these concepts by looking at the other sources of sound, disturbances created at the lips or tongue, or by looking at the other areas, the subglottal and transglottal areas. But the principles are the same. In the end, the many components interact with the ever-changing cross-sectional areas of the air spaces, yielding complex patterns of pressures that reach the outside air, the largest change in cross-sectional area. From there, those disturbances create the complex waves we perceive as speech sounds, expressing the wide variety of human interests and communications.
Such a profound ending. All right, so let's talk about the key points. So that's basically the kind of background you want to be thinking about when we talk about the source filter theory. So essentially with the source filter theory, the source is the sound generated by the vocal folds, and the filter is how that sound is modified as it transmits through the vocal tract. So one of the main points of the video was the concept of the elasticity of the air that we generate in our lungs and the elasticity of the air that surrounds us. So that elasticity means that air particles are easily disturbed. So a couple of points that I thought were important. One was noting that the frequency of vibration, and I think we know this intuitively, but I like the way he said it. The frequency of vibration is different from the speed of propagation. So the frequency of vibration, or the pitch that we generate at the level of the vocal folds, is completely unrelated to how fast the sound is going to travel through air. So one of the numbers that becomes important when we get to some formulas we're going to talk about next week is the speed of sound, 350 meters per second. And we use that as a ballpark. We know the speed of sound changes in water, that we know it changes how quickly whale communication can travel and how far whales can talk to each other. It changes with temperature. I hear differences in how close the freeway sounds at my house, depending whether it's a cold morning or a warm morning. So we know that there are some things that affect the speed of sound. But in general, we can think of that 350 meters per second. One of the concepts that I thought was getting a little bit belabored was the idea that the wave that we generate at the level of the vocal folds is the incident wave. Okay, so we're producing a waveform here that is traveling through the vocal tract. And then it essentially meets this huge wall of air, which causes part of that wave to bounce back. Okay, so you have an incident wave going out. And don't worry about getting this yet, because we'll talk about it lots more yet next week. You've got an incident wave coming out, meets the wall of air. Some of that keeps on going, and some bounces back through. Okay, so the bouncing back is the reflected wave. And those two waves interact with each other. So the incident wave that we produced is going to be interacting with the reflected wave going back. And it's this constant interaction that actually allows us to perceive things like vowels. It's the way the vocal tract is modified that creates changes in the relationship between the incident wave and the reflected wave. So we're going to start first talking about the vocal tract like he did, as a single tube, not any weird shape, a tube that's closed at one end where the vocal folds are. Even though we open and close them, basically it's a tube that's closed at one end and open at the lips. Okay, so the basic concept of the source filter theory and the quarter wavelength theory is based on an unobstructed tube. It's like our vocal tract is a straight pipe, and it will tell us how, what frequencies are able to make it through the vocal tract easily and which ones are lost. So one of the things that he didn't really emphasize very much, because I was starting to get dizzy looking at those little particles going back and forth, and then that spooky sound in the background. I thought we needed like Halloween music or something. One of the things that he didn't emphasize was that at the level of the vocal folds, we are producing a complex wave. Okay, we know we're not producing a sine wave. So remember back when we talked about the harmonics, we're producing a waveform in a female voice that has energy at 200 hertz, 400 hertz, 600 hertz, 800 hertz. All of those frequencies are traveling through the vocal tract simultaneously. Okay, it's not like 200 goes first and then you have 400 and then you have 600. It's all one big cross-sectional chunk. So even though people use for illustration one little air particle bouncing through there, you have to think of a complex waveform and all those frequencies being present at once. Because that's what starts making sense when we get into the cool stuff, which is things like how singers tune the vocal tract to make certain frequencies more stronger, so that they can be heard above orchestras. Okay, so always keep in mind that even though you think about a single air particle for illustrative purposes, really what you have is a huge range of frequencies that are traveling through the vocal tract at once. Questions? Those are the key points that I want you to get from that one. The source filter theory, and in particular the quarter wavelength resonating theory, takes a little bit of background to just sort of get into it. So what we're trying to do now is lay the groundwork for it. Don't feel like you have to have it all down yet, because next week is when we're really going to approach that. So I wanted to show you a different video. This one is about articulation and a little bit more about how the articulators impact the sounds that we produce. This one was actually done by a professor of mine at the University of Washington. So whenever I see it, I think about sitting in his acoustics class, and he sounds just the same, which is kind of okay memories, but not great. But never tell him that. But he does explain things really well, and there's some good images in here.
As we listen to this speaker, we can understand her quite easily. But as she speaks, she operates one of the most complicated biological mechanisms in the human body. Let's peer inside the body to view some of the unseen parts that help create the voice.
There is, according to legend, a boiling pot of gold.
Looking at this X-ray of another speaker reading aloud, we can see that speech production is an incredibly dynamic process, with many body parts moving at once. During speech, we carefully regulate the timing and sequence of these parts to rapidly change the sounds of spoken language. Here is a magnetic resonance image of the vocal tract of a female singer. With this MRI, we can see a cross-section of her head. We can also see the size and shape of the air column inside her mouth and throat as she sings from vowel to vowel. This air column, called the vocal tract, forms the resonant space for the voice. Just as the hollow spaces in a trumpet form its resonance, each change in the vocal tract causes a change in the tonal quality of the voice. Let's look at the singer's production of the consonant M. First, there's the mouth, which is sometimes called the oral cavity. Then the throat, sometimes called the pharynx. The pharynx actually has three parts: the laryngopharynx, which is the part nearest the larynx, the oropharynx, which is the part nearest the oral cavity, and the nasopharynx, the part nearest the nasal cavity. And then we have the nasal cavity itself, where nasal consonants and nasal vowels resonate. Finally, we see the laryngeal tube, the small area between the vocal folds and the pharynx. We should think of these areas as one unit, one hollow tube. Now let's identify some of the structures that can change the shape of the vocal tract. In this image, we see the lips, jaw, tongue tip and blade, tongue body, tongue root, soft palate, pharynx, nares or nostrils, epiglottis, and larynx. These structures shape the air column from the larynx to the outside air at the lips and nose. By visualizing the air column in 3 dimensions, we see the net results of the movements of the articulators. As the shape of the air column changes, the resonance characteristics of the voice change. Our ability to regulate and control many tiny movements of these structures allows us to produce the wide range of sounds we use for speech. In this presentation, we use various techniques to help you understand how the articulators move during speech production. Keep in mind that cinefluorographic film shows only 2 dimensions. Also, because speech articulation involves rapid movements of many structures, we often use higher camera speeds to slow down these movements. This sequence was taken at the normal camera speed. Here, the speaker produces the same syllable at the same rate, but we show it at a higher camera speed. Because X-ray motion pictures are sometimes difficult to interpret, we have used digital enhancing techniques to render the best view possible. We also use a series of MRI displays to show the locations of specific articulators during speech.
When the air column has this particular shape, the sound we hear is the vowel E. Notice the high arch of the tongue in the forward part of the mouth, which is why this vowel is classified as a forward vowel in the International Phonetic Alphabet. And here is the shape of the vowel OO. Notice that this vowel has the high arch of the tongue in the back part of the mouth, which is why this vowel is called a back vowel. E. Oo. In fact, every vowel sound is caused by the shape of the air column and is classified by where the tongue constricts the air column.
Let's look at the articulators one at a time. Here is a view of the lips during speech. They can move various ways, such as spreading or rounding. The position of the lower lip relates to the position of the jaw. During speech, the lower lip moves more than the upper lip. The lower lip can move somewhat independently of the jaw.
High in a tree. Matt Winter was on.
The lips, as shown by this MRI, are in a neutral position for the vowel E. They are more round and extend forward for the vowel O, changing the size and shape of the opening. This seemingly slight change has a tremendous effect on the resonance for these vowels. E, O. As we watch these images, notice how far the upper lip can stretch when rounding. Notice, too, the variety and subtlety of the different lip positions. Each position changes the size and shape of the air column, and consequently the sound. For example, notice that the speaker can adjust the position of the lips, whether one is more or less forward than the other. When the lips protrude, as for oo, they extend the vocal tract. When the lips spread, as for E, they shorten the vocal tract. Now let's look at the jaw movement on this X-ray film. The primary motion of the jaw is up and down. Sometimes, however, a speaker will move the jaw forward or back, or from side to side.
Let's look at the movements of the jaw, a major shaper of the vocal tract. The jaw, or mandible, is hinged to the skull with a joint called the temporal mandibular joint, or TMJ. Let's zoom in and look at this amazing joint. We can see the connection. From the skull, a membrane hangs down like a curtain. At the base, a cartilage is attached in the center. Beneath it, another membrane hangs, from which the jaw is suspended. These membranes are like two curtains, with a rod through the middle, which allows our jaw to swing in virtually any direction. The jaw can move up and down, forward and back, and even side to side. The magnetic resonance images you have been seeing have shown the fleshy part of the body, not the bones. Therefore, as we combine the jawbone with the fleshy parts from the MRI, you can clearly see that the jaw is like a cradle for the tongue, an easy moving base, a support. The tongue and jaw are intricately bound to each other. But notice as we watch a few images that they move independently, yet still together, as if in a continual dance. Obviously, a loose, free jaw will allow the tongue to move with complete freedom, to gracefully shape the air column.
The tongue is the most important of the speech articulators. Its position determines to a great extent the size of the mouth cavity. Its position also affects the size of the pharynx. As the tongue moves backward or forward, the pharynx widens or narrows. Because the tongue attaches to the jaw by several muscles, when the jaw rises or lowers, the tongue also rises or lowers until the tongue resists. Although the jaw and the tongue can move independently, they usually move together. The tongue has three articulators: the tip and blade, the body, or dorsum, and the tongue root. Each part of the tongue can move independently. But because the tongue is an integrated mass of muscle tissue, moving one part affects the ability to move the other parts. Here is a speaker producing a series of ta syllables using the tongue tip and blade. Next, we see a speaker moving the body of the tongue to produce repeated ka syllables. Because the structure of the tongue is a continuous mass of muscle tissue, movements of one portion affect movements of the remainder. Look here at the vowels E, A, and Notice the forward movement of the tongue root as the speaker speaks the vowels.
I, O, A, A, oo.
The soft palate or velum forms the fleshy back part of the roof of the mouth and extends into the pharynx. It functions like a valve, opening and closing the passage to the nasal cavities. In the position shown here, it is closed. Now it is open. Now closed. Now open. Here is the consonant M, as in Mary. The soft palate is lowered, allowing air into the nasal cavities. And because the lips are sealed, air can escape only through the nose. Here is the shape of the vocal tract when the speaker says N, as in Nancy. Again, the soft palate is lowered. This time, though, the tip of the tongue seals the mouth by pressing the tip of the tongue against the alveolar ridge. And in this picture, we see the NG as in hang. This time, the tongue contacts the soft palate, sealing off the air passageway into the mouth and directing all of the air into the nasal cavity. Because the mouth is sealed off, we see a dramatic difference in the size and shape of the resonance tube. The normal position of the soft palate is low. For speech and singing, however, the soft palate is generally raised, dipping down now and then to produce a nasal sound. Because the soft palate can be higher or lower, even when closed, its position can change the size and shape of the vocal tract, and therefore the sound. Look at the movement of the soft palate in this X-ray. The soft palate and tongue have a common muscular attachment at the sides of the structures. Thus, moving one can affect the position of the other. When the tongue is low, the soft palate tends to be low. When the tongue is higher, the soft palate is higher. The pharynx is a muscular tube extending from the base of the skull to the larynx. The pharynx opens in front to both the oral cavity and the nasal cavity. The opening to the oral cavity is called the oral port. The opening to the nasal cavity is the nasal port. The muscles that form the lateral walls of the pharynx can constrict the pharynx. Near the top of the pharynx, called the nasopharynx, the side walls constrict when the soft palate elevates and relax when the soft palate lowers. Elevating the soft palate closes the airway into the nasal cavities. During the production of nasal sounds, the upper pharyngeal constrictors relax. In the middle of the pharynx, called the oropharynx, the side walls constrict more for low vowels than for high vowels. These changes in the pharynx width help create the resonance needed to speak vowels properly. However, the width is largely determined by the position of the back of the tongue. In the lower pharynx are two movable structures that affect speech, the epiglottis and the larynx. The epiglottis moves back or forward to cover the opening of the larynx and to direct food and liquid into the esophagus. The epiglottis moves forward for voice production. In this animated MRI display, the larynx raises as the singer sings from a low-pitched vowel to a high-pitched vowel. The height of the larynx is inversely related to the length of the resonating vocal tract. A number of other structures involved in speech cannot move. They serve as the places of contact for the movable structures. The hard palate is a bony plate that forms the front of the roof of the mouth. The front of the roof of the mouth is the alveolar process, a ridge that holds the upper teeth. The teeth are also important in speech. The upper and lower incisors are the most important teeth for producing consonants. So far, we've looked at the articulators while producing isolated vowels and consonants. Speech, however, is not as simple as it may appear from such descriptions. When sounds are linked together to produce connected speech, the process becomes much more complicated. In the first place, the articulation of a particular sound depends on the sounds adjacent to it. This can best be demonstrated with vowels. As a speaker produces the vowel ah in isolation, and then in various contexts, Notice how the tongue configuration varies as the phonetic environment changes.
Ta ta.
The articulation of a vowel can vary even within the same consonant context. Such changes seem to occur with the lengths of vowels. As syllables are produced more rapidly and the vowels shorten, less time is available for the tongue to move to the ideal position for the vowel. As a result, the tongue undershoots the position that it would attain on an isolated, sustained vowel. At a slow rate of speech, the tongue is here on the vowel in this syllable. At a fast rate, the tongue is higher in the mouth, closer to its resting position. The effects of the length of the sound and the context of the consonant occur because of the mechanical nature of the articulatory system. The position reached by a structure during a vowel sound depends on the distance it has to move from its position on the preceding consonant and the time available for the movement. Co-articulation can best be demonstrated on syllables involving bilabial consonants such as P and B. Because the exact position of the tongue is not critical for the production of this sound, the tongue can start to move into the position for the following vowel at the same time the P is being produced. Notice the difference in tongue positions on the consonants in these two syllables. Co-articulation can take place to some degree even when the tongue is involved in producing the consonant. For the sound T, the tongue tip must contact the alveolar ridge. However, the posterior portion of the tongue is relatively free to approximate its position for the following vowel.
Ta ta. Ta ta. Tu tu.
The dynamic characteristics of speech articulation can also be illustrated by the effects of the adjacent nasal consonants on vowel sounds. During the vowel E, the velopharyngeal port would generally be closed. However, when saying the word mean, the port is open throughout the entire production. It appears that the velum does not have time to close for the vowel sound before it must again open for the final consonant. This interaction between sounds results in the nasalization of vowels in nasal consonant contexts.
Complicated ideas about the rainbow have been formed. The difference in the rainbow depends considerably upon the size of the water.
You've seen only a few examples of how the articulatory mechanism operates in speech sound production, and how articulatory characteristics vary when sounds are put together in connected speech. A number of conclusions can be drawn concerning the nature of the articulatory mechanism. First, speech articulation is a dynamic process. There are really no places in connected speech that can be considered as steady state. The articulators are in almost constant motion. As a result, it cannot be assumed that speech is simply a series of individual stable units linked together. Second, movements of the articulatory structures are rapid. Third, since the activities of different structures are not independent, it's not valid to consider movements of individual structures separately. Fourth, the articulatory characteristics of sound in connected speech vary due to the interactions with adjacent sounds and to the co-articulation of sounds. Such variations do not appear to be just meaningless artifacts of the system. The acoustic modifications caused by these variations have been shown to aid in the listener's perception of the sounds. As a final comment in this film, we must observe that as we study the complexity of speech articulation, there is little wonder why children and adults occasionally make speech errors. The real wonder is how any of us can speak clearly at all.
Reaching the mid-Pacific with the status of a world power.
Makes me afraid to talk. Okay, couple of key points from that. First of all, I think the idea of talking about an air column is important, because I always think about the articulators, and I don't think about the articulator shaping an air column. But really, it's the elasticity of the air column within us and the elasticity of the air around us that is actually forming the sounds. So one of the things that we want to do as we think about how the different sounds are formed are picturing where the constriction is, even in the vowels, where the high vowels, front vowels, low vowels, where the constriction is, and how that is changing the shape of the air column that's produced. And we'll get more into this when we talk about specific vowels. So another point that is important when we get to the quarter wavelength resonating theory is the idea of the effect of lip rounding on the vocal tract. Because one of the things that's a critical component in determining resonating frequencies is the length of the vocal tract. And even though it seems relatively inconsequential, rounding the lips has a huge effect on the length of the vocal tract, and in turn, it has a huge effect on the resonating frequencies. And we saw that a little bit the other day with, I think, R and W. When we looked at the effect of lip rounding, it depressed everything. It lowered F1, 2, and F3. So we'll see that when the vocal tract is longer, all of the formants, or all of those bands of energy, tend to be a bit lower. So what did you think about the amazing temporomandibular joint? It's got a great voiceover voice, right? It's just so perfect. The amazing temporomandibular joint. When would you ever be moving your jaw side to side? Chewing, yeah. Speech production? It would be really distracting. Like one of the first things you would target in anybody you would see them doing. It would be terrible. I can't even imagine it. You might see it in some types of involuntary movement disorders. You could actually have lateralization of the jaw with them. I've seen videos of a person who had, I think it was Huntington's chorea, and one of the involuntary movements that he did was jaw opening. His jaw would just suddenly open completely. So it's easy to imagine that it might go lateral as well. Those of us who grind our teeth at night exercise that lateral side-to-side movement a lot. I would not recommend it. Oh, the other thing that Dr. Menifee said that a lot of people would not agree with. Remember when he was talking about the height of the larynx? It was a relatively brief little piece. And he said that when a person produces a high pitch, the larynx is elevated, and when a person produces a low pitch, the larynx is lowered. That is in exceedingly untrained singers, like the ones who go on their tiptoe like when they're trying to go up high, and then they go oh when they're trying to go low. Really, really well-trained singers never move their larynx. It's always in the same place. It's always relatively low because they want to have a big pharyngeal area, and it's always constant. So anyone with the larynx going up and down, you can say, well, you're not a classically trained singer. They're probably on American Idol. I haven't watched the latest round. I've been afraid to. The other thing that I thought was weird, I loved looking at the X-rays of the mouth movements. I thought that was really cool, with the tongue being cradled in the jaw. But did you notice anything weird when the person was saying ta 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 ta? What seemed odd about that? Yeah.
I feel like there was a lot of jaw movement.
Yeah, like completely wrong. Lots of jaw movement. Okay, if you say ta 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 really quickly, go ahead and try ta 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 ta. You moving your jaw? Probably not at all. Ta 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 ta. You can pretty much do it completely with a stable jaw. And what does the stable jaw allow us to do? If you're doing do you guys know the term diadochokinetic rates? Okay. So if you're doing diadochokinetic rates, I think it's one of the coolest terms in speech path, right? You feel like really important when you say it. When you're doing diadochokinetic rates, you can move the muscular part of your tongue much more quickly than you can move both the jaw and the tongue. So we always want to function from a platform of stability. Stability is good. So if I would see a client, for example, doing ta, 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 the first thing I do is give them a bite block. And you stick something in their mouth like a pen with the ink in and go ta, 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 and they'd be able to do it much faster. And one of the things that you see in people with neurological disorders is the inability to keep the jaw stable and move the tongue independently. So what we saw with the ta, 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 ta is something that somebody with a neurological disorder would do because they lack that ability to dissociate the jaw and tongue movement. And we want the tongue to be moving freely with a stable base. Okay, co-articulation we're going to be talking about a bit more probably next week. So let's get into a bit of the source filter theory. I'll take any questions you had on the videos we just saw. Anything from them? Okay. Isn't it great when you go, yeah, I knew that. I knew that. Yeah, got that. Knew that for years. Yeah.
There was one thing that they showed, and maybe this is just me not knowing the structure well enough, but it's like when it was showing, I think it was like the velum closing, and it seemed like there was this other piece, like kind of tipping up into the nasal cavity. I don't remember. It was like kind of towards the end, and it was just like this weird little. I was like, "What is that?"
Yeah, we've been. I'm glad you mentioned that because we've been doing a new kind of functional MRI that actually, after tons and tons of signal processing, allows us to view articulatory movements when the person is being scanned, and the velum shows up really, really well. And one of the researchers who's done it has brilliant soft palate closure, but his uvula comes out like this. And so you see this great seal of VP closure of the soft palate against the posterior pharyngeal wall, and then you see at a really odd angle his uvula. So I'm wondering if it might have been that.
It may have been. It looked like it was further forward, almost like it was like the velum would move down and it would tip up.
Not sure, unless it was down towards where the epiglottis was. Was it that low?
It was up.
See, I thought some of those were a little bit hard to see. You know, and those had been like digitally modified and looking pretty good. One of the things we saw, though, when Dr. Menifee was talking about the tongue tip and how the tip and blade move independently from the, what was the other part? The base of the tongue, and what's the one in the middle? The tongue body. Yeah, I think that's it. I always wanted to call that the blade. We did the moving fMRI with the research person we've been looking at fairly extensively. And she's the one who has a unilateral lingual paralysis on the right side, and I believe some degree of spasticity, which makes her movement slow and relatively tight. And we had her in the scanner doing ta, 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 and then the other researcher in the scanner doing the same thing. And what we noticed was with the researcher who doesn't have any neurological problems, you could really see the tip of his tongue perfectly. It was like the tip of his tongue and then this little undulating U. It was just brilliant. And only the tip of the tongue would be going up for the t sound. With the person who has unilateral tongue paralysis, and one of the disadvantages is we couldn't get a front view and we couldn't see what side we were on. But what was remarkable was that the whole tongue moved to make the T sound. So she wasn't able to get that differentiation of the tongue tip versus tongue body versus root of the tongue. So you could clearly see the front portion of the tongue that should have been the tip flipping upward, but instead she was making contact probably around here on the tongue. There was a perfectly acceptable T. But what was remarkable was the fact that the tongue was moving as a unit, rather than being able to have those discrete movements that's really characteristic of a non-neurologically impaired tongue. So that was really cool to see. I wasn't expecting it at all, because when I watch her speak, I see in her mouth the tongue deviating to the right. So I thought I'd see the deviation, but what I wasn't expecting was that whole tongue-body kind of movement, because she really isn't able to get the control and the discrimination within the tongue body itself to do that precisely. Okay, that was an aside. So let's talk about the source filter theory. I know you know the basic concept, right? So what we have here is the sound spectrum that's produced at the level of the vocal folds. Okay, this is unmodified sound spectrum. This is your head's chopped off, but remarkably you can still speak. And it's the sound that is generated just with the vocal folds vibrating. It sounds like kind of, not that I've heard this actually done in a decapitated person, but it sounds like when you simulate it in models, it sounds kind of like a mechanical buzz. There's no richness to it whatsoever. It sounds like just a waveform that you generate from a machine. And so that's considered the source. And we talked about the fact that the filter is everything that is involving the shape of the upper vocal tract. Back. The shape of the upper vocal tract. So you have the sound source traveling through here. And this source, this pure acoustic spectrum, when it comes out of the vocal tract, has been modified. And here we can see that as it traveled through the vocal tract and it was going through all of those incident waves and reflecting waves, certain frequencies made it through the vocal tract really easily and maintained their energy. And some people would even say, although this is kind of controversial, that it had energy added to it, that those areas became stronger. And certain frequency regions lost energy. So you no longer have this straight line decline that's characteristic of the sound source that we produce at the level of the vocal folds. Instead, you have certain frequency regions that are enhanced and other frequency regions that are basically damped out. So it's the determination of those frequency regions that gets a little bit ugly when we think about the quarter wavelength resonating theory. And the source filter theory applies to all of the sounds we produce. The quarter wavelength resonating theory really applies to vowels. So that's sort of the framework to have now. So I want you to understand that even though the quarter wavelength resonating theory appears really obnoxious, I always put it relative to this. This is a way that you can calculate, you don't have this because it was too much to put in print, and God knows I don't want you to memorize it, right? So this is how you can calculate semitones, like the notes on a piano, from hertz without using tables or logarithms. Okay, now listen to this. You multiply the difference of the two vibration numbers by 3,477, divide the product by their sum. In case the triple of the larger vibration numbers exceeds the quadruple of the smaller one, multiply the greater number by 3 and the smaller number by 4 before starting the operation indicating above, and finally add 498, the perfect, not the equal tempered fourth, to the result. If, on the contrary, the proportion of the two vibration numbers is greater than 2 to 3, multiply the greater number by 2, the smaller number by 3 before starting the operation indicated above, finally add 702, the perfect fifth, to the result. Isn't that brilliant? Can you imagine somebody figuring that out? And the perfect fifth would be like a fifth of Jim Beam because you're done? I thought that was just incredible. So we will never ever calculate semitones from hertz without using a table, right? So the rest is just a piece of cake. Okay. So keeping that framework in mind, what we're looking at is the transfer function of the vocal tract. And essentially when we talk about transfer, we mean how energy is transferred from the larynx or the vocal folds into acoustic energy, into the atmosphere. So here again we see the classic illustration of a transfer function. We have the source, with a 12 dB decline in amplitude as it goes up in frequency. This is a really exaggerated transfer function of the resonating frequencies of a tube that's closed at one end. Okay, so this is how a tube resonates when it has the vocal folds at one end, straight pipe out to the air. Okay, these are the resonating frequencies of that tube. So as the sound goes through the tube or the vocal tract, it is shaped according to the resonating frequencies of the vocal tract. Okay, so these are the resonating frequencies of a tube that's closed at one end. These resonating frequencies interact with the source, and the output is essentially a combination of the two. Okay, it shows the effect of the transfer function or the effect of the resonating frequencies that were superimposed on the source. You okay so far? Okay. Now, there are a couple of really critical, they seem basic, but they're really important to keep in mind. A couple of critical concepts as they relate to this transfer function, which is essentially key concepts of how the shape of the vocal tract, which determines the resonating frequencies within the vocal tract, how that impacts the source. So essentially, if you think about this image, you can see that it's the frequencies that are altered. Okay, some frequency regions make it through easily, some frequency regions lose energy. And this is the concept that it's a frequency selective transmission system. So the way the resonating frequencies of the vocal tract are superimposed on the source spectrum is based on frequency. Certain frequencies within the source are going to resonate easily, and others are going to lose energy. Okay, so it's a frequency selective system. And if you think about frequency going along the horizontal axis, and you think about the resonating frequencies in that tube that's closed at one end and opened at the other, you can see how it's allowing, okay, so here we've got frequency going along this way. This is amplitude, indicating how strong those frequencies are once they travel through this tube that has resonating frequencies associated with it, based on tube closed at one end, open to the air. Okay? So all tubes and pipes and vibrating objects, they all have resonating frequencies associated with them. So if you think of chimes, you know that big chimes, they're open at both ends, at least my chimes are. Big chimes have a lower pitch, a lower resonating frequency than the little teeny tiny chimes do. Okay, so the resonating frequency depends on the shape and the size of the object that is resonating. Okay, so the resonating frequency of the sounds that we produce depends on the shape and size that we can generate within the vocal tract. So the very first theory is acting as though I'm going where basically the cross-sectional diameter of the vocal tract is the same the whole way through. So if you go you can feel that there's really not a constriction anywhere, as opposed to like you know, where you really feel your tongue constricting in different places. Is considered a neutral vocal tract. The dimension, the cross-section inside the vocal tract is the same from the lips all the way down to the vocal folds when you say an So it's as close as we get to that tube that's closed at one end and open out in the air. Okay, so that's what the quarter wavelength resonating theory is based on, is an unconstricted tube, which for our speech purposes would be an sound. Okay, so we know it's frequency selective based on the shape of the resonator. It will resonate certain frequency regions well, and it will damp out others. So when you picture frequency selective, picture that acoustic spectrum traveling through the vocal tract. The one that we know for men would be 100 hertz, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, all the way up. For women, or let's do kids, it would be 300, 600, 900, all the whole number multiples of the fundamental frequency. That whole acoustic spectrum is what's traveling through the vocal tract and being modified by the resonating frequencies of the vocal tract. Okay? It cannot make it through unimpeded.
So in that case, could like the shape of someone's mouth, like if they're a guy, make their voice closer to like a little bit, not like obviously closer necessarily, but closer to like a girl's voice, just because like they have like a bass frequency that's at a certain level, but their everything up above there kind of just changes it a little? Or
it's an interesting point, but I don't think so. Because we need to think about how the sound's modified. So they're still operating with the same fundamental frequency, right? Yeah. So there are certain dialects, certain I don't know how to say this PC. There are certain types of speech associated, for example, with gay men, right? There's certain they shift their tongues so they have different resonating frequencies than straight men do. So they still have the same source, but they're modifying that by the shape of the vocal tract, typically to move the tongue a little bit more anteriorly, which changes the sound, especially S's and some of the vowels that are produced. So in order for a man, like particularly a bass, to move more towards a female pitch, he'd really have to be changing the source down here. And there are not a lot of differences between male and female vowels. You know, they're all different because the size of the vocal tract is different, but we'll see that proportionally we do it all the same way. So if there were a way to put like a man's voice through my vocal tract, it would sound odd because lower, bigger vocal folds go with bigger heads than mine. And it's one of the reasons why when you have some mismatches, for example, in people who are dwarves, is it dwarves or midgets? One of them has proportionally the same head size compared to the body, and the other has a larger head size compared to the body. Sometimes you hear odd resonance associated with that because the size of the vocal folds isn't a good match for the size of the head, and it sounds odd. So when you have some mismatches like that, you go, something about that doesn't sound natural, but you can't quite figure out what. But you need a pretty big pitch change for a man to be perceived as a woman. I don't think it happens in the way that we produce sounds. That's fairly neutral across males, females, and kids. Other questions? All right, let's stop there. Try to be comfortable with the basic concepts up to the frequency selective part of things. Okay? All right. Have a good weekend, guys.